Prince William stood in the center of a private room at Windsor Castle and read his mother's words aloud, and by the time he reached the second page, Queen Camilla had already risen from her chair and walked out without a word. What had taken nearly 30 years to arrive had been delivered in the space of 3 handwritten pages, and the silence that followed was the kind that nobody inside those walls had been prepared for. The letter was not a farewell. It was not a grieving mother's final goodbye. It was something far more precise than that, and the moment Camilla understood what she was hearing, she made the only decision left available to her. But the question that nobody in that room could yet answer was who had been holding this letter for 3 decades, and why they had chosen this exact moment and not any other to finally let it go. Before we go any further, make sure you are subscribed, because what Diana actually wrote across those 3 pages, and who protected it for nearly 30 years without anyone inside the palace realizing it was still out there, is far more extraordinary than anything the headlines have suggested. But that single moment inside Windsor only makes sense once we go back to the morning. William first understood what his mother had left behind, and what she had always intended him to do with it. Prince William did not knock. He walked through the door of the sovereign's drawing room at Windsor Castle at precisely 1 o'clock on a Saturday afternoon, and the first thing anyone in that room noticed was that he was carrying nothing. No briefcase, no folder, no aide, walking half a step behind him, the way protocol usually demands for a meeting of this nature. He crossed the carpet to the center of the room and stopped. King Charles sat in the high-backed armchair near the marble fireplace with a tartan blanket across his knees. Queen Camilla stood beside the writing desk near the window. The head of the Privy Purse occupied a low chair at the coffee table, a leather ledger open across his lap. Nobody spoke first. William reached inside his jacket, removed a folded set of pages, and placed them flat on the surface of the coffee table without explanation. Then he began to read aloud. His voice was steady, not performative, not emotional in the way that someone reading from a letter they had written themselves might sound. He read the way a person reads when they want every word to land exactly as it was written, carefully, at an even pace, with no inflection added that was not already built into the original. The pages were vellum, heavy, cream-colored, the kind of paper that does not bend easily and makes a particular sound when handled. The ink was a deep navy blue. He read the first paragraph, then the second. The room remained completely still. Charles did not move. The head of the Privy Purse lowered his eyes to the table. When William reached the section near the bottom of the second page, the lines Diana had underlined so heavily the pen had nearly pressed through the surface, something shifted in the room. Not dramatically, not with raised voices or sudden movement. It shifted the way pressure shifts in an enclosed space when one person understands, before the others, exactly what they are hearing. Camilla's hand, which had been resting on the writing desk beside a silver fountain pen, went still. She did not look at her husband. She did not look at William. She looked at a point somewhere between the fireplace and the window, and she stayed there for a moment that several people present would later describe, privately, as unnervingly long. Then she stood. She straightened the front of her jacket. She said nothing. She walked to the private side door on the far wall, opened it, and pulled it closed behind her, with the specific quietness of someone who has decided, in the space of a breath, that remaining in a room is no longer something they are willing to do. Her chief of staff, who had been standing near the window behind her left shoulder, hesitated for exactly 2 seconds, then followed. The door clicked shut. William lowered the pages from in front of him and placed them back on the coffee table. He looked at his father. Charles was still in the armchair. He had not stood. He had not spoken. He was looking at the 2 small gold objects William now set beside the vellum pages. 2 charms, side by side, shaped like polo mallets, each no larger than a thumbnail. Nobody in that room yet understood what those 3 pages had taken 30 years to become. The sovereign's drawing room emptied slowly. The head of the Privy Purse gathered his ledger, excused himself with a quiet word to the king, and was gone within minutes. William left shortly after. No press briefing, no statement prepared, no aide dispatched to the Kensington Palace Communications Office with instructions on how to manage the afternoon. He simply walked back through the corridor, the way he had come, climbed into his vehicle, and returned to London without speaking to anyone who did not already know exactly what had happened inside that room. Charles stayed. A senior aide who has served the king for well over 2 decades, and who was working in the adjoining office that afternoon, would later describe the hours that followed as among the most unnervingly quiet he had ever witnessed inside Windsor's private quarters. No summons came, no bell rang. No private secretary was called through to receive instructions or draft correspondence. or begin the kind of quiet, administrative response that usually follows a meeting of consequence inside those walls. The king simply remained in the drawing room with the vellum pages and the 2 gold charms on the coffee table in front of him, and the afternoon light moved across the carpet the way it always does in early spring at Windsor, slowly, indifferently, without any awareness of what the room had just held. Camilla did not return. She went directly to her private sitting room on the upper floor, and the first call she made was not to her press secretary and not to her chief of staff, who was already waiting outside the door. It was to her personal lawyer. The conversation lasted just under 40 minutes. When it ended, she sat for a long time without picking up the telephone again. Those closest to her household would note afterward that she canceled every engagement scheduled for the remainder of that day. Not through her office, not through a formal communication to the relevant organizers, but through a single quiet instruction, passed by word of mouth, down a very short chain of people who understood that no written record of the cancellation should exist before the legal position had been assessed. The television network found out through a press liaison, a nationally cleared broadcast interview, one that had been in preparation for the better part of 3 weeks, with lighting calibrated and camera positions locked and airtime protected across the schedule, was cancelled with less than 24 hours remaining before it was due to air. The reason given was a scheduling conflict. The executive producer, a man who had been managing royal media appearances for more than 2 decades, received the news in the middle of his studio floor and stood there without speaking for a moment that his own colleagues found difficult to read. Then he put down his coffee and picked up his telephone and began making calls of his own. In the specific grammar of royal communications, a cancellation of that kind means one thing. Something has gone wrong behind closed doors, and the household is not yet ready to put a senior member in front of a camera and a live microphone. William, by that point, was already back at Kensington Palace. He had not eaten. He had not called his communications team. He sat at his desk in his private office and looked at the copy of the forensic authentication report that Dr. Vance had signed before 1 o'clock that morning. And he understood, with the particular stillness of someone who has been planning something for a long time and has now watched it begin, that none of them yet understood how long this had actually been in preparation or whose hands had been holding it. William's dark Range Rover cleared the Althorpe estate gates on a cold, overcast morning in late March, and he had come alone. No communications aid, no press briefing issued, no statement prepared for the Spencer family office or for anyone else who might have noticed the vehicle turning off the main road and onto the long gravel approach toward the house. His close protection officers followed at the respectful distance that serious occasions require, close enough to do their job, far enough to understand that what was about to happen was not something that needed witnesses beyond those already arranged. Earl Charles Spencer was waiting in the stone corridor just inside the heavy oak side door. The greeting was not warm, exactly. It was quiet in the way that serious things are quiet, the particular silence between 2 people who both understand that what is about to take place cannot be undone once it begins. The Earl did not offer pleasantries. He did not ask about the drive or comment on the weather, the way people do when they are filling space. He simply held up a small tarnished brass key, attached to a faded red ribbon, gestured for William to follow, and turned toward the stairs. They descended past rows of stored family portraits and crates of 19th century silver, through the particular smell of old stone, and preserved things that belongs exclusively to houses that have been standing in the same place for several hundred years. At the far end of the cellar, the Earl stopped in front of a heavy door and entered a short sequence into a climate control panel mounted on the wall beside it. The door opened. The room inside was clean, temperature regulated, and almost entirely empty, except for a single steel table positioned in the center of the floor. On the table sat a small, scarred leather writing case. The initials pressed into the leather near the handle D.S. in gold foil had mostly rubbed away over the decades, leaving only the ghost of letters that had once been sharp and deliberate. Earl Spencer pointed to the case and said only that a senior estate solicitor had discovered it 3 days prior while clearing out an old filing cabinet in the estate's private legal office. He said it had remained completely untouched since September of 1997. Then he stepped back and said nothing further, because there was nothing further that needed to be said. William took the brass key from his uncle, fitted it into the lock, and turned it. The mechanism released with a sharp metallic snap. He lifted the lid. Inside sat a small stack of private photographs, a leather-bound diary with a cracked spine, and a single heavy vellum envelope sealed with blue wax. The wax bore the unmistakable impression of a personal signet ring. And on the front of the envelope, written in a handwriting he had known since before he could read the distinct, sharp cursive his mother used when she wanted her meaning to be absolutely clear, was a single word: his name. William held the envelope without moving for a long moment. He turned it over. On the back, partially obscured by the fold of the seal, was a secondary stamp from a London courier firm. He looked at the date pressed into the ink beside the firm's address. And something shifted in his expression, not dramatically, not visibly enough for anyone watching from the doorway to name it precisely, but shifted nonetheless. The date on the courier stamp was August the 15th, 1997. But what happened the moment William broke that blue wax seal changed everything he thought he understood about his mother's intentions. Earl Spencer pulled the vault door closed behind him, and the sound it made, that particular heavy click of a sealed room returning to silence, was the last sound William heard from the outside world for a long time. He sat down on a plain wooden chair beneath the bare bulb of the basement ceiling. The envelope was still in both hands. He had not yet opened it. He held it the way people hold things they understand or about to change something, turning it once, then again, feeling the weight of the thick vellum against his fingers, and the slight rigidity of whatever was folded inside. He used the blade of his pocket knife to slice carefully through the blue wax, working slowly along the edge of the seal so as not to damage the paper beneath it. He pulled out 3 pages of closely written text. The ink was a deep navy blue, the specific shade Diana reserved for her most private correspondence, the shade she used when she did not want anyone to mistake her meaning or later claim they had misread her intent. He looked at the date written at the top of the first page in her distinct, sharp hand, August the 14th, 1997, 17 days before Paris. He began to read. His eyes moved at a steady pace, not rushing, not slowing at the difficult parts the way people sometimes do when they are preparing themselves emotionally for what a sentence is about to say. He read the first page through to the end, then the second, and then, approximately halfway down the second sheet, his eyes stopped, completely stopped. Diana had underlined a passage so heavily that the pen had nearly pressed through the vellum. The lines beneath were not emotional. They contained no appeals to sentiment, no expressions of love, no language that could be dismissed as the private grief of a woman writing under duress. What she had written in that section read like something that had been reviewed by a legal advisor before the ink was dry, precise, structured, and entirely without ambiguity. She had named Camilla directly. She had specified, in the careful, measured language of someone who understood exactly what they were constructing, that under no circumstances should that woman inherit, utilize, or publicly associate herself with the personal jewels, ancestral property, or ceremonial titles belonging directly to the Spencer family lineage. The restrictions were not suggestion. They were not emotional requests dressed in legal language to give them the appearance of weight. They were the kind of language a court could read, without requiring interpretation, the kind that does not leave room for a palace advisor to stand up 3 decades later and argue that the author's true intention had been something softer, something more forgiving, something the institution could quietly absorb and move past. William sat without moving for a long moment. He had come to Althorpe expecting a letter from his mother. He had come prepared, in the way that sons who lost their mothers young are always in some sense prepared, for something personal, for her handwriting on a page addressed to him, for words that belonged to him alone. What he found instead was a legal memorandum, precise, witnessed, enforceable, built not from grief but from strategy, by a woman who had spent 15 years inside the institution and had understood, with complete clarity, exactly how it operated when it wanted something to quietly disappear. He reached back into the envelope to check whether anything remained inside. His fingers found something in the deeper fold of the lining, something small and solid. He turned the envelope over and shook it gently. A tiny gold charm dropped into his palm. He recognized it immediately. A polo mallet, no larger than his thumbnail, with 2 initials engraved on its surface. He had seen it catch the light at a kitchen table at Kensington Palace when he was a small boy, seen it on his mother's wrist. On the bracelet she wore constantly, the one that moved when she reached across a table or pulled him close. She had not included it by accident. There was no note explaining its presence because there did not need to be. The charm was her signature in a language that no forger could have known, that no disgruntled archivist could have replicated, that no palace operative working from the outside could have placed inside a sealed envelope without leaving forensic evidence of the intrusion. It told him, without a single additional word, exactly whose hands had pressed that blue wax seal. But the document was only half the story, and what William found when he looked more closely at the bottom of the 3rd page told him something the legal language never could. William's personal solicitor arrived at Kensington Palace within 45 minutes of receiving the call. He came through the private entrance on the east side of the building, carrying a secure briefcase and no questions, and he was shown directly to William's private study. Without passing through the main reception area, where staff moved between offices, and where the wrong pair of eyes at the wrong moment could turn a quiet afternoon into something considerably more complicated. He sat down across from William at the mahogany desk, opened the briefcase, and waited. William laid the 3 vellum pages flat on the surface between them. The solicitor put on his reading glasses and read without speaking. He did not react visibly to the first page or the second. When he reached the final paragraph on the 3rd sheet, the section Diana had underlined with the kind of deliberate pressure that leaves an impression in the paper long after the ink has dried, he stopped. He read it a second time. Then he set the pages down, removed his glasses, and looked at William with the particular expression of a man who has just confirmed something he had hoped would not be true, simply because of the complexity it was about to create. He explained what William already suspected but needed confirmed by someone with the professional authority to say it plainly. Diana had not written a personal letter. She had formally executed a legal memorandum in the presence of 2 independent witnesses, both of whose signatures were clearly visible at the bottom of the 3rd page in ink, consistent with the body of the document. Under English trust law, the memorandum was fully binding. If William chose to enforce its terms, certain aspects of Camilla's current administrative use of assets connected to the Spencer estate would constitute an immediate and actionable legal violation. The palace held no royal prerogative to override it. Parliament did not need to be consulted. The Spencer family trustees retained the authority to act entirely on their own. William listened. He thanked the solicitor. Then he asked him to prepare a single photocopied page, 1 page only, not 3, accompanied by a brief, formal note on Kensington Palace letterhead. No demands, no ultimatum, no explanatory language that could be characterized later as an attempt at coercion. Just the page, and the note confirming it had originated from his office. The solicitor nodded, prepared the document at the desk, and left within the hour. The copy reached Clarence House by private courier that same afternoon. Camilla's legal team received it, reviewed it, and constructed their defensive position within hours. It was, on its surface, a reasonable argument. The document William had sent was a photocopy, without the original vellum pages submitted to an independent archival authority for formal examination. The memorandum carried no verifiable legal standing. It could be classified as an unverified draft. It could be challenged on the grounds of authentication. They prepared a holding statement for the High Court and filed it before midnight, with the quiet confidence of a team that believed they had identified the one crack in an otherwise solid wall. The argument lasted until William's response arrived at 2 o'clock in the morning through the secure internal messaging system that connects the royal households. Kensington Palace had completed full forensic authentication using an independent outside specialist. The specialist was Dr. Elizabeth Vance, Scotland Yard's former senior forensic handwriting analyst, a woman who had spent the better part of 3 decades authenticating documents in cases where the difference between genuine and fabricated determined outcomes that could not be appealed. She had arrived at Kensington Palace at 10 o'clock that evening under a high-priority clearance code issued directly from William's office, carrying a large leather scanning case and equipment that hummed quietly on the mahogany table for nearly 2 hours under ultraviolet light. She had examined the micro-grooves of Diana's navy blue ink at a magnification level that revealed details entirely invisible to the naked eye. The paper stock carried a watermark from a specialist stationery manufacturer based in Gloucestershire that had gone permanently out of business in 1999, meaning the vellum itself could not have been sourced after that date under any circumstances. The 2 witness signatures at the bottom of the 3rd page showed identical ink depth and micro-variation to the body of the text, confirming they had been applied in the same session, on the same day, with the same instrument. This was not a draft. It was not a modern forgery. It was not a piece of modified archival material assembled by someone with access to old paper and a careful hand. It was a fully executed legal document, authenticated to the last fiber of its paper, and the primary line of defense that Camilla's team had spent the evening constructing had collapsed before the sun had even risen. The machinery had already begun moving, and the question none of William's advisors could yet answer was why this box had survived 30 years of estate audits completely untouched. The television studio in central London had been ready since 6 o'clock that morning. The lighting grids had been calibrated across 3 separate rigs to account for the particular quality of natural light that enters through the studio's north-facing windows in early spring. The camera positions had been locked the previous afternoon, following a technical rehearsal conducted with a stand-in seated in Camilla's chair. The broadcast slot had been protected across the national schedule for the better part of 2 weeks, and the executive producer, a man who had been managing royal media appearances for more than 2 decades and who understood the specific grammar of palace communications better than most journalists working the beat, arrived at the building before anyone else that morning because he wanted to be certain that nothing was left to chance. The red telephone from the palace rang at 8:47. He took the call standing up, the way people take calls they have not been expecting and for which they have not yet arranged their face. The Clarence House press liaison delivered the cancellation in a single sentence. A scheduling conflict had arisen overnight. The interview would not be proceeding. The network would be notified through the formal channels within the hour, and Clarence House regretted any inconvenience to the production team. The executive producer stood in the middle of his studio floor for a moment without speaking. Then he set down the telephone and looked at the lighting grids above him and the locked cameras and the chair that had been positioned at precisely the correct angle for a woman who was not coming, and he understood in the way that anyone who has spent 2 decades inside this particular world understands that a senior royal does not cancel a nationally cleared broadcast at less than 24 hours' notice because of a scheduling conflict. A scheduling conflict is what a junior aide tells a regional publication when a minor engagement needs to be quietly rearranged. It is not what Clarence House tells a national network after 2 weeks of preparation and a technical rehearsal and a protected broadcast slot. He picked up his own telephone and began making calls. Within the hour, 3 separate journalists working royal beats for 3 separate publications had received word through their own networks that something had shifted overnight inside the palace, not through an official briefing, not through a coordinated leak from a named source with an agenda and a message to place. Through the connective tissue of palace adjacency, the assistants and drivers and junior secretaries and retired advisors who each carry one fragment of a larger picture, and none of whom can see the whole thing from where they are, standing. Diana's name surfaced in the early afternoon. The word letter appeared in a message thread between 2 correspondents, approximately an hour after that. By early evening, the phrase hidden document was moving across platforms faster than any communications office could track it, let alone contain it. Camilla's office issued a holding statement, 4 sentences. Private family matters were being handled internally. No further comment would be forthcoming at this time. It was the kind of statement that the palace communications machine produces, when the alternative, saying something specific, carries more risk than saying nothing at all. Every experienced royal correspondent reading those 4 sentences understood them as confirmation rather than denial, because a household with nothing to conceal does not deploy the phrase private family matters in response to questions about a cancelled television interview. The palace's formal response followed shortly after. It matched Clarence House in length and in tone, and in the specific emptiness of its language. 4 sentences confirming that internal matters were being addressed through the appropriate channels. No elaboration, no timeline, no named spokesperson available for follow-up questions. Royal historians appearing on evening television that night pointed out something that stopped several of their interviewers mid-sentence. In the nearly 30 years since Diana's death, not a single private legal document bearing her name had ever been formally activated against the palace. Letters had surfaced. Diaries had been referenced, recorded interviews had aired, but a formally executed legal memorandum, forensically authenticated by an independent specialist, and enforced through the Spencer family trust structure that had never happened. Not once. The precedent, one historian noted carefully, choosing his words in the particular way that serious people choose words when they understand they are being recorded, was without modern parallel. But one final meeting still remained, and what was said inside that room would determine everything that followed. The hotel dining room in Belgravia was empty at 10 o'clock on Saturday morning, except for a single figure sitting by the window, holding a porcelain teacup with both hands. She wore a simple dark wool coat and a strand of pearls. She did not stand when William entered. She did not offer a warm greeting or an explanation for why she had asked to meet him here, rather than anywhere connected to either household. She simply pointed to the empty chair across from her and pushed a small velvet jewelry box across the white tablecloth without a word. William sat down. He opened the box. Inside was a gold charm shaped like a polo mallet, identical in every detail to the one currently sealed inside an evidence bag in his private study at Kensington Palace. Lady Sarah McCorquodale, Princess Diana's eldest sister, co-executor of her original will, and one of the very few people alive who had been present in the weeks immediately following Diana's death, looked at her nephew across the table and began to speak. She told him that she was the one who had placed the leather writing case inside the Althorpe filing cabinet in the spring of 1998. She had kept the master key in her personal safe for 28 years. The estate solicitor had not stumbled across the box during a routine administrative cleanup. He had found it because she had called him 3 days before William's visit and told him precisely where to look. The discovery was not an accident. It had never been an accident. Lady Sarah explained the timeline with the calm precision of someone who had rehearsed this conversation in her mind for a very long time. Following Diana's death, a team of palace lawyers had arrived at Kensington Palace within weeks to conduct an official inventory of her private papers. The operation was thorough and swift, and conducted with the specific efficiency of an institution that understands the value of controlling what enters the historical record and what does not. Lady Sarah and her brother had quietly intercepted several boxes of highly sensitive personal correspondence before the official team completed their sweep, not to hide the material from history, but to protect it from being buried inside the royal archives at Windsor, where it would remain classified and inaccessible for the next 100 years under standard sovereign document retention rules. She had kept Diana's leather writing case in her own custody because Diana had asked her to. Specifically, personally, with one instruction attached: wait until the moment is right. Lady Sarah had watched from a careful distance as the years passed and the palace adjusted, and Camilla's position within the household slowly consolidated. She had not acted during the turbulent early years after Diana's death, when emotions were too raw and the legal ground too unstable for a document of this kind to land cleanly, rather than simply inflame. She had not acted during the years when William was still a young man finding his footing within an institution that had not always made that process easy for him. She had waited with the particular patience of someone who understands that releasing a legal weapon at the wrong moment is functionally the same as not having it at all. The trigger, when it finally came, was not dramatic. She had read a series of quiet reports not published, not circulated through official channels, but passed between people who move in the spaces adjacent to the palace and who notice when administrative boundaries begin to shift, indicating that Camilla's office had begun a careful institutional expansion. Specifically, an attempt to review the terms of the traditional Spencer family heirloom loans and audit the financial boundaries of the Duchy of Cornwall, in ways that had no clear precedent in the arrangements that had governed those assets for the previous 2 decades. The moment Lady Sarah understood what that expansion was reaching toward, she picked up the telephone and made the call to the estate solicitor. She had not acted out of malice. She had acted because Diana had asked her to act, and because the moment had finally arrived that Diana, writing at a desk in Althorpe in August of 1997, had apparently anticipated with a clarity that nobody around her had recognized at the time as the particular kind of strategic foresight it actually was. Lady Sarah kissed William on the cheek, stood, adjusted the front of her coat, and walked out of the hotel without looking back. She left the velvet box with the second gold charm on the tablecloth between them. William sat for a moment in the empty dining room, looking at the 2 matching objects, one in the evidence bag at Kensington Palace, one on the white linen in front of him, and understood, with a stillness that had nothing performative in it, that the quiet war was no longer simply about jewelry and old letters. Somewhere across the city, the king had already sent word that he wanted his son at Windsor before nightfall. The cancelled interview was the first visible thread, and once journalists began pulling it, the shape of what lay beneath started to emerge in the particular way that palace stories always emerge, not through a single coordinated disclosure, but through the accumulation of small confirmed details that individually mean nothing and collectively mean everything. By midday, 3 national newspapers were running fragments simultaneously. Not identical fragments, not the same sourced information passed through different hands. 3 separate fragments from 3 separate corners of the palace's extended orbit, each one partial, each one accurate as far as it went, and none of them sufficient on its own to tell the full story. Diana's name appeared in print for the first time that afternoon. The word letter followed approximately an hour later in a brief item on a newswire that was careful with its language in the specific way that careful legal departments require when a publication is not yet certain enough of its information to commit fully to what it is implying. By early evening, the phrase "hidden document" had escaped the wire services entirely and was moving across platforms at a speed that no communications office could track, let alone manage. The palace issued its 4-sentence statement at 6:43. It satisfied nobody. In the specific vocabulary of royal crisis management, a statement that declines to address the substance of what is being reported is understood by every experienced correspondent as confirmation that the substance is real, because institutions with nothing to conceal do not respond to questions with the phrase "private family matters being handled" internally. The BBC led its evening bulletin with the statement. So did ITV. By 9 o'clock, every major broadcast outlet in the country had assigned at least one senior correspondent to the story, and the question being asked across every platform simultaneously was the same question. What did the letter actually say? And how had it remained hidden for nearly 3 decades without anyone inside the palace knowing it still existed? Royal historians appeared on evening television and said things that stopped their interviewers mid-sentence. One historian, a woman who had spent the better part of 4 decades researching the modern monarchy and who chose her words with the particular care of someone who understands that what she says on camera will be quoted for years, noted that in the entire period since Diana's death, not a single private legal document bearing her name had ever been formally activated against the palace. Letters had surfaced before. Recorded interviews had aired. Private diaries had been referenced in court proceedings. But a formally executed legal memorandum, independently authenticated by a forensic specialist of Dr. Vance's standing and enforced through the Spencer family trust structure outside the reach of the royal archives that, she said, had never happened. The precedent was without modern parallel, and the implications of it extended considerably further than the specific assets named in the document. Public opinion divided almost immediately. It divided in the way that anything connected to Diana always divides sharply, emotionally, and along lines that had been forming for decades, and that no single news cycle was going to dissolve. One side saw William as his mother's son, protecting a legacy the institution had spent 30 years quietly attempting to absorb into its own historical narrative. The other raised a harder question whether deploying a private document written by a woman who had been dead since 1997 served anyone's dignity, including hers, or whether it reduced a complex and private grief to an instrument of institutional warfare that Diana herself might not have sanctioned had she lived to see the moment chosen for its release. Neither position was entirely wrong, and the palace, still silent beyond its 4 sentences, offered nothing that might resolve the tension between them. Commonwealth correspondents noted that Camilla's public positioning had shifted without formal announcement. Heads of state communications offices in several countries placed pending formal engagements with Clarence House quietly under review, without explanation and without any public statement that might force a response. International outlets that had spent years covering the rift between the Wales and Sussex households found themselves filing unexpected updates, because what was unfolding was not a story about 2 brothers and a transatlantic disagreement. It was a story about a document sealed with blue wax in August of 1997, and about the woman who wrote it and about whether the institution she had spent 15 years fighting had ever truly moved past her at all. But the most revealing moment of the entire story had not yet happened, and it would not require a single word to be spoken. 3 days after the sovereign's drawing room fell silent, Camilla appeared in public for the first time. The engagement was a scheduled garden party at the Royal Horticultural Society in Chelsea, a long-standing fixture in the royal calendar that the palace communications team had described internally in the days before everything changed as routine, seasonal, unremarkable. The kind of appearance where the primary function of every senior royal present is to move through a greeting line at the correct pace, smile at the correct moment, shake the correct number of hands, and give the cameras absolutely nothing they did not intend to give them. The team had prepared the usual briefing notes. The usual security arrangements had been confirmed. The usual advance work had been done by the household staff who arrive hours before any royal appearance to ensure that nothing about the afternoon will surprise anyone who matters. Nothing about that afternoon was routine. William stepped out of the vehicle first. Charles followed. Camilla emerged last, and as the household arranged itself on the gravel path for the short walk toward the garden entrance, something shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way that a casual observer standing at the perimeter barrier with a camera phone would have been able to name immediately or describe with any precision to someone who had not been there. It shifted in the precise, deliberate, entirely intentional way that everything inside a senior royal public appearance shifts when the people arranging themselves on that gravel path understand exactly what they are communicating and to whom. Camilla walked one step behind, not beside Charles, not at his shoulder in the position that her office had spent the better part of 2 years carefully establishing as the standard configuration for their joint appearances, the positioning that placed her visually and symbolically on equal footing with the sovereign in every frame that the camera pool captured. One step behind and slightly to the left. The positioning that, within the internal hierarchy of royal protocol, carries a meaning that requires no caption and no explanation for anyone who has spent serious time studying how this family uses physical space to say the things it cannot say aloud. William walked to his father's right. The greeting line lasted approximately 40 minutes. Several hundred guests moved through it in the warm afternoon light, holding their programs a little too carefully and trying not to stare at the 3 figures they had come to see. A veteran royal photographer who had been covering palace engagements for more than 30 years, a man who had stood at the edge of events like this so many times that that he could read the emotional temperature of a royal appearance from the angle of a shoulder or the distance between two pairs of feet, positioned himself at the far end of the garden and worked through frame after frame across the full duration of the afternoon. He would note afterward, in a private conversation with a colleague whose discretion he trusted, that in 140 frames taken across the entire event, Queen Camilla and the Prince of Wales were never photographed standing side by side. Not once. In every frame where both of them appeared within the same composition, there was always something between them: a guest, a host, a member of the household staff holding a program, or one of them had their body angled partially away from the other in a way that prevented the kind of image the camera pool had been capturing routinely for the previous 2 years. It was not accidental. Nothing at an appearance of this kind is accidental. There was one moment, approximately halfway through the greeting line, where Camilla and William came face to face in the natural movement of the afternoon. He extended his hand. She took it. The handshake lasted exactly the correct number of seconds, not a fraction longer, not a fraction shorter than the social requirement of the moment demanded. She smiled. He smiled. The cameras captured it from 4 separate angles, and every image showed 2 people performing the specific and highly refined public fluency that the royal family has developed across generations. The capacity to stand inside a moment of profound private tension and offer the watching world absolutely nothing that confirms what it already suspects. The veteran photographer lowered his camera after that frame and stood for a moment without moving. He had been doing this work for a very long time. He had photographed this family through funerals and weddings and jubilees and crises, and the particular category of afternoon that pretends to be none of those things while being all of them simultaneously. He understood, standing at the edge of that Chelsea garden in the thin spring light, that he had just spent 40 minutes documenting something that would be studied and referenced and returned to for years, not because of what anyone had said, but because of what the arrangement of 3 people on a gravel path had communicated without a single word being spoken. Nobody in that garden needed to know the details of what had happened inside Windsor Castle. The afternoon had already told them everything. The basement vault at Althorpe was empty now. The steel table where the leather writing case had rested for nearly 3 decades stood bare under the bare ceiling bulb, and the room had returned to the particular stillness of a space that has held something significant for a very long time and has now released it. The climate control unit hummed quietly against the far wall. The heavy door stood open. There was nothing left to find, nothing left to protect, nothing left to wait for. The scarred leather case with the faded gold initials near the handle had been moved to the Spencer family's formal legal archive, cataloged under a reference number known only to the trustees, and placed inside a preservation unit that would hold its contents intact for the next generation of historians who would eventually be permitted to read what Diana had actually written across those 3 vellum pages. It was the right place to end. What William had done inside Windsor Castle was not, in the end, the act of a son settling scores on behalf of a mother the palace had wronged, though that was how certain corners of the press would characterize it in the days that followed, because that framing was simpler and more emotionally legible than what had actually occurred. What he had done was more precise than that, and considerably more cold-eyed. He had enforced a legal boundary that Diana had constructed, specifically because she understood that legal boundaries, unlike emotional appeals, cannot be weighted out by an institution whose primary skill is patience. She had not written those 3 pages in anger. She had written them in the specific clarity of a woman who had spent 15 years learning exactly how the palace operated when it wanted something inconvenient to quietly cease to exist, and who had decided, in her final weeks, to use that knowledge one last time on behalf of the people she was leaving behind. What William gained was not simply the return of certain heirlooms, or the formal restriction of Camilla's administrative reach, though both of those outcomes were real and documented and enforceable. What he gained beneath those visible outcomes was something considerably more durable. He had demonstrated, without a press conference and without a single public statement, that he held a category of moral and legal authority within the family that Camilla's team could not replicate, neutralize, or outmaneuver, because the weight of a mother's formally executed wishes, authenticated by Scotland Yard's own forensic specialist, and enforced through a trust structure entirely outside the palace's jurisdictional reach, is not an instrument that can be confiscated or redirected. It simply exists, for as long as William chooses to hold it, and everyone inside those walls now understood that he was willing to use it. What Camilla lost was not her title. It was not her public standing, which remained formally intact. And it was not the warmth of whatever private understanding she and Charles had built across the decades of their relationship. What she lost was momentum, the slow, patient, largely invisible administrative expansion of institutional footprint. That is how power actually moves inside a structure like the British monarchy, not through announcements, not through dramatic gestures, through the gradual redrawing of boundaries that most people outside the household never notice until those boundaries have already shifted and the moment to contest them has quietly passed. That expansion had been stopped, and the stopping of it had been witnessed by every senior figure inside the household, which meant that any attempt to restart it would now carry a cost and a visibility that had not previously existed. What Charles protected was the monarchy itself, its appearance of continuity, its capacity to absorb a crisis of this particular kind, without fracturing publicly in ways that could not be repaired before the next formal engagement, required the family to stand together on a gravel path and perform the fluency that the institution depends upon. He had protected it at a personal cost that no official record would ever formally acknowledge, a cost paid in the particular silence of a man who chose, when the moment required a choice, the crown over the woman beside him. Whether that choice diminished him or defined him was a question that the people who had been in that drawing room would carry privately for a very long time. And Diana, a woman who had been dead for nearly 30 years, who had sat at a desk at Althorpe in the August heat of 1997 and written 3 pages by hand with a navy blue fountain pen and sealed them with blue wax and pressed her signet ring into the surface while it was still warm and placed a gold charm inside the fold and handed everything to her eldest sister with a single instruction. Who had done all of this before the world she was protecting her sons from had taken the shape she feared it would take, who had trusted that the right person would know when the right moment had arrived, and who had been correct about that, as it turned out, in the same way she had been correct about a great many things that the people around her had not credited her with understanding. She had always been thinking that far ahead. The letter was sealed in August of 1997, but it was written for a future. Diana understood far better than the institution that spent 3 decades believing it had already moved on from her.